Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're here today in the middle of a debate where the Liberal government has curtailed debate on a censorship bill. They are actually censoring debate on their censorship bill. And to put into perspective what's happening here today, people who have reviewed this bill from all political stripes, from all walks of life, from all background in Canada, have said that this bill will create in Canada the most authoritarian media control regime in any Western country. This is a fight worth having. It's a fight worth having tooth and nail, and every member of the governing caucus needs to give their head a shake, and including the NDP as well, who are in coalition with this bill, on the fact that this is going to censor Canadian content. So in the brief time that I have today, because we know the government is shutting down debate on this, in the brief time I have today, I want to make an appeal directly to my colleagues in the NDP and in the backbench in the Liberal government caucus to really think this through. So first of all, the government is saying, the government talking point is that this bill is needed to modernize the Broadcasting Act, to reflect, to bring Canadians in alignment with what's happening today versus 30 years ago, pre-internet. But the reality is that this isn't about what Canadians want or need. This is about the few elite media broadcasters and content creators who, frankly, in the past have been creating content off of a criteria of Me Too incidents, of doing what's best for profit, and frankly, marginalizing racialized voices, women's voices, independent women creators. That's the history of these elite companies who need this bill to squeeze the dregs of profits out for their shareholders in a last-ditch attempt to prop up a failing business model that they did not have the foresight or the wherewithal or the innovation to keep competitive, while small independent creators gradually built up platforms and voices for themselves on new content creation platforms like YouTube, even like streaming services. It's not Canadians' fault, and Canadians shouldn't be subject to government censorship because a few well-connected producers, media companies, and whatnot want to have more profit for their shareholders. You know, again, for parties in this place to purport to stand up for intersectional, racialized, for women's voices, in the long run, what anybody who is voting for this bill in this form is doing is actually taking away their voice, because at the end of this day, what this bill does is give the government the power to select what Canadians see. Okay? That is what this bill does. And morally, that is wrong. Other colleagues here, even colleagues from the NDP, have said, well, what about large platforms like Alphabet or like Meta? Okay, this bill does nothing. This bill does nothing to improve algorithmic transparency. It only makes it worse. In fact, what it does is it says, let's keep censoring on those platforms, and now let's add another layer of censorship where the government gets to also downgrade what voices are heard. Can you imagine, Mr. Speaker, if Stephen Harper had introduced this bill in the House of Commons, if Stephen Harper had created a government ministry where he got to control, where his appointees got to control what was upgraded or downgraded? There would have been pitchforks and torches in the street. The NDP would be outraged. There would have been signs across the country. And instead, because we're acquiescing to the Liberals, who have a long history of propping up elitism in thought and elitism in production in this country, somehow it's okay. The reason why people from all political stripe across this country, people who would, there are so many disparate political voices who are saying this is wrong. Instead, what our government should be doing is modernizing legacy, archaic bills like the Broadcasting Act to get out of the way of innovative new forms of producing content so that we can have more choice, more innovation, and so that those groups, people who have traditionally been platformless, don't have the loom of the sword of Damocles of the government CRTC regulation hanging over them and wondering whether or not they're going to be successful. There's no transparency in this bill. The worst part of it is that people aren't even going to know what's being downgraded or upgraded by the federal government. How is that possible in a Western democracy where freedom of speech is supposedly and purportedly to be the cornerstone of what we do? I think about I'll make it about me for a minute, Mr. Speaker, or any other woman who's in this place. This place has typically repressed female politicians' voices. The Canadian media, for generations, has had a hard time with putting Canadian women at the forefront. In my time in office, I've been able to use platforms like this to get around the elites who might not allow me any voice, to be able to talk directly to my constituents. How do I know that any of my female colleagues in this place aren't going to have their content upgraded or downgraded based on whether or not the government and their appointees think that what I am saying or what I am advocating for is right? This bill only benefits elites. It props up a model that no longer works in this country, and I guarantee you the people who will suffer are the people who need these platforms the most. You know, I cannot believe that the government is curtailing debate on this bill. What they should be doing is listening and working collaboratively with opposition to come up with amendments on this steaming pile of garbage so that Canadians who have vociferously voiced and said we cannot have curtailments on freedom of speech in this country, that their thoughts are appeased. Why wouldn't the government accept an amendment to exempt user-generated content if the only reason that they won't accept that amendment is because they intend to downgrade and hide user-generated content in Canada? That is motive. Why isn't that in there? They have refused it time and time again. And again, like, if they really wanted to create more freedom of speech, they should be trying to work with these big platforms to have more algorithmic transparency. They're not doing that. They're adding another layer of algorithmic downgrading. They should be putting amendments in this bill. And frankly, you know, people are talking about content that's been created in Canada. We put $1.5 billion into the Canadian Broadcasting Company every year. You know, my colleagues from the Bloc are talking about French language content. Is that money being well spent on French language content? The CBC has had atrocious human resources issues in the last year. There's all sorts of questions about their conduct and what's happening. And instead of objectively looking at these legacy elite institutions on how they should be forced to modernize and come up with the change in how Canadians communicate, they're putting in more elite blockages to what Canadians can see and which Canadians can be heard. And that is not my Canada. We should have more diverse voices. And frankly, for Western Canada, you know, how many journalists in the Parliamentary Press Gallery are from Western Canada? One? Maybe? The only way that we get heard is through these types of platforms. And now, no offense, Mr. Speaker, this government does not have the best track record on supporting Western Canada. They're telling us that the CRTC gets to regulate what content is seen from Western Canadian content creators? No. This is 100% a violation of every Canadian's right to free speech. I cannot believe that any Liberal backbencher who actually cares about supporting women, marginalized voices, would think that this is a good idea. All this does is it's designed to prop up a legacy model that is going directly into rich shareholders' profits, while small independent voices are going to be downgraded by this. There is no transparency in what they're talking about. It is vague. It is a steaming pile of garbage. It has been panned by every political stripe, by experts from academia, from law, from the media, from content creators themselves. And the only people that are speaking in favor of this, are people who have already made it and have benefited for a very long period of time by a system that no longer is in line with the times. And that is why it's wrong. And that's why this government should not be censoring debate, Speaker. We should be robustly debating it. This should be amended, and it should be scrapped.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader. Well, I certainly appreciate the member's intervention today, Mr. Speaker. We don't hear as much from her as we used to, and I miss that, and I'm being genuine. She's actually one of the more progressive in the Conservative Party, and I wish that we would hear her voice more often, notwithstanding the fact that I disagree with her on this particular issue. But I did take note, Mr. Speaker, that in her speech, she spoke specifically to government backbench and the NDP as though those are the only people in the House that support this, but that's actually not true. The entire Bloc Québécois caucus and the Green caucus supports it as well. So the only party in here that doesn't support this is the Conservative Party. And to suggest that, I think it is a huge stretch, Mr. Speaker, to suggest that the Bloc Québécois, the separatist party, is somehow going along with a scheme to allow Cabinet to make decisions on algorithms and what people see. So I'm wondering if she can comment on why she specifically just talked about Liberal and NDP and completely missed the Bloc and Green in her statement.
Honourable Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
I actually want to start with my colleague's first statement. Speaking in this place is a privilege, and it's about quality, not quantity. And that's a lesson he should undertake. And he should also understand that speaking truth to power is something that is our responsibility, not being a toady for the PMO.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The Honourable Member for Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for an excellent speech because she really points out some of the flaws of this bill. Professor Michael Geist, I know she's worked with him in the past, said this bill is going to restrict how people can be heard. And I want to read the definition of censorship into the record, Mr. Speaker. Censorship is defined as the suppression of speech, public communication, and other information. I was wondering if the member could kindly comment on why this government can't be trusted with any type of legislation like this, and if she could comment on Margaret Atwood's comment saying that this is creeping totalitarianism and why we have to be very cautious of it.
Great, Crest. Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Well, I think Margaret Atwood presents a lot of tales that we should take into consideration, like the need to continuously protect women's rights under any circumstance, Mr. Speaker. I also think, though, that Margaret Atwood is one of those voices who wouldn't necessarily speak in favor of a Conservative Party position, but would certainly speak in favor of the fact that free speech is an underpinning of Canadian democracy, and it's something that should be protected at all costs. This government is in the middle of a foreign interference scandal. It's had multiple ethics violations. It kicked out Jody Wilson-Raybould, Canada's first Indigenous minister, for speaking truth to power. I don't trust this government as far as I can throw them.
Question et commentaire. Questions and comments. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Longueuil Saint-Hubert. Mr. Speaker, my colleague said in her speech that this bill, C-11, would only benefit certain elites. I don't know who she's talking about. In Quebec, 80% of the members of the Artists' Union make less than $20,000 a year. I don't know what she's talking about when she talks about elites. My friends who are writers, script writers, actors, all these people want us to vote for this bill, C-11, as soon as possible.
It's Michel Godin, and actually I was one of the many people in Canada who, frankly, were, I'll just say it, the victim of Anglicization. So I understand how important it is to ensure that French language programming and the right to French language learning is made available to all Canadians because it's part of our cultural heritage. But the 20,000 artists that he just talked about have been for generations blocked by elite media corporations who pick and choose who want to come forward. The reality is that this government, with the billions of waste that we've seen in recent years, could have done so much more for Quebec content creators to help them thrive in a new media market. This bill, all it's going to do is strengthen the capacity of the people who have typically repressed French voices in the past, and we need more of them. So that's why I implore my colleagues from the Bloc to use their power and their passion to convince the government to come up with something that is better and that supports all Canadians, particularly Francophones.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank my colleague for her intervention. And I think it is a fair criticism about using closure. It's a very serious issue in terms of our parliamentary democracy. And she also mentioned about the Stephen Harper era. And I was there during that time. And as she knows, over 100, I think 14 or 17 times, the Harper administration used closure on 11,000 pages of parliamentary law that took place. So I'm wondering whether she has some reflection in terms of all of those things, which actually involved women's issues, environmental issues, issues over pipelines, issues related to the economy, even some things that actually went to the Supreme Court and came back. And so maybe some reflections about when and how this issue should be resolved, because it really goes back into the 1950s with regards to the first time debate was closed was actually over a pipeline issue. So perhaps we can have a little insight on that. Thank you.
Honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
I would love to take a trip back to memory lane. 2015, when houses were half the cost in Canada, when people could actually afford rent, when the budget was balanced, when we had economic growth, when our international peers looked upon us to actually get things done instead of with embarrassment. Those were the golden days, if we could only have them back.
Reprise the débat.